we are pretty much ready to start. We'll probably just wait for 1 minute, and in the meanwhile, we'll make a small announcement. Some of the participants already know, but JBSPDF has now, it's now officially a part of an extended part of JBNSTS. So I think that's, we all think that's a good progress. And so we have been seeing more participation from the JBNSTS leadership, Paramita ma'am and Moitri ma'am. We have been in touch with them. They are recently quite busy with holding the JBNSTS exam virtually this year with with virtual invigilation and all that. But after that, we'll have more activities together. We've also received the names of and the contact details of the current scholars, and as each batch gets selected, we'll get them. Also, there is a new scheme called the Bigyanikonas, which have started, which is essentially several women in STEM fields doing undergrad who are selected through the same JBNSTS examination, and will also be receiving the contacts for them, and they, I guess, whoever are willing will be part of our forum as well. So I think we can start, and more people might be joining in the meanwhile. So let me introduce briefly myself first. I'm Debarghya Sarkar. I'm currently a postdoc at Harvard University and Massachusetts General Hospital. And I am a JBNSTS scholar of 2010 batch. So today we'll be having a discussion on how to start and navigate through PhD research, how to do that successfully. And we have with us Professor Rudra Dutta from North Carolina State University, who is a JBNSTS scholar of the 1987 batch. He's a professor of Department of Computer Science since 2013, and also currently serves as the Associate Department Head. His current research interests focus on design and performance optimization of large networking systems, internet architecture, wireless networks, and so on. Before joining North Carolina State University, he worked for IBM as a software developer from 93 to 97. Briefly describing his academic pursuits, he received a Bachelor of Engineering in Electrical Engineering from Jalafri University in 1991, and a Master's in Systems Science and Automation from Indian Institute of Science in 93, and a Ph.D. in Computer Science from North Carolina State University in 2001. And one of the main reasons that we have invited Professor Dutta for this conversation is that in addition to several technical courses that he teaches at NCSU, he also offers what I think is a very important course, which is essentially, to my understanding, it's kind of a workshop kind of course where students are taught how to effectively navigate through their PhD research. And that's why we are very fortunate to have him here. He'll be talking to us briefly in an hour or so about the same things, the main aspects of it, and we'll have some questions. So yeah, with that, I would like Professor Rudra Dutta to take over, and as you would wish the session to progress, we'll accordingly moderate.
So thank you so much, Debarghya, for that introduction, but also to you and the rest of JBSPDF for the invitation and the opportunity to talk. And first of all, I heard that announcement, so commendations again on what the PDF is doing, and I'm glad that it's hooked up more closely with JBNSTS itself. So looking forward to even more high impact activities from your side. I hope I'm nicely audible, or I could put on a microphone if this is not good.
I can hear clearly.
Okay, then we'll just, okay. I see a thumbs up from one of the participants. So when we set this particular date up, I confess that I had not realized that this would be Pujo time.
Yeah, me
Of
too.
course, this is a very strange year and a very strange pujo. Nevertheless, I was wondering whether there would be anybody here at all, except perhaps Debargo, because he has to be there as organizer, and me. And I'd be fine with that. And maybe others would benefit from the recording later. So for whoever has turned up, I really appreciate. So thanks for being here. Let's see. I was going to show some slides. There's not a lot on the slides, but they serve as sort of starting points for talking about things. So let me try to see if I can share my screen. And when the slides become visible, please let me know.
Yes, they are.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so as Debarghya has said, the title of this talk has been set as Navigating Through PhD Research, so that's what I put there. But it seems like a very tall order, so I took the liberty of adding a caveat by calling it an introduction after that. You've all heard more the introduction, the very nice introduction Debargo gave me. So I won't repeat that. Rudra Dutta, with the exception of saying that, yeah, the first thing that happened to me, in a sense, of course, everything else, grade school, preschool, and stuff like that. But, quite apart from my other degrees, one of the first things that happened to me that was of significance for my career and my academic career to me was the JBNSTS scholarship. And then the other things that you've already heard. I was going to give a very brief introduction to my how I got there or how I got today to this talk. Again, some of this has been covered, but very quickly. I started with a bachelor's in electrical engineering, went straight on to a master's degree in what was called system science and automation, which is sort of half computer science, half automation and electrical engineering. Worked for IBM, did part of my PhD part time, the rest of it full time, because it's hard to wrap up a PhD before while still working for a fairly demanding employer like IBM. Eventually moved to academia. That was 20 years ago. My master's thesis was actually in AI, specifically in backpropagation neural networks, perceptrons, and so on. Those of you who are possibly in AI will definitely know of this, but even others will have heard of it in these days of everything is deep learning, if you are anywhere close to computing. But soon after the master's thesis, and when I went into IBM, I decided to move to a different kind of networks altogether, the internet type, so the computer communications networks. And partly that decision was based on the observation that at that point it seemed like I would not have a lot of real world oriented stuff to do for many years, if ever, if I stuck to that specific topic of my master's thesis. And I think that wasn't quite wrong, but on the other hand, it wouldn't have been my whole career because here we are. Now everything is neural networks or some variant thereof. Some things are older concepts in newer guise, other things are brand new concepts building on them. So the field is definitely expanding and exploding now. As I said, currently in my 20th year, I did the usual faculty things, graduating PhD students, publications, trying to get funding, constant battle on all of these things. Still doing that. Of course, there are other aspects and things like service. As one progresses in one's career, a little more time and opportunity opens up to be able to do things that are specifically of one's interest. So I continue to do those things, obviously. So actually, right now I'm in the early stages of executing a fairly large project that is quite possibly going to be the biggest one in my career. I don't know if I'll ever be in a bigger one, fingers crossed. But there does open up time and opportunity for exploring a bit and getting into different sorts of things that are also potentially impactful. And one of the things that some of us have been doing in our department has been to try to improve the first year PhD experience. we have a fairly good PhD program, and we think our PhD students have a decent experience, but anything can always be improved, and we can actually see specific room for improvement. We could over the last almost 10 years, I would say, of reflective activity on the part of the department, which was partly also something I contributed in or led. So this is one of the things that came out of that, a specific seminar that we now as a department teach every year, every fall, and strongly urge, not quite require, but strongly urge each of our incoming PhD students to take in their first semester. So that's the thing I think that caught Debarghya's or somebody else's, the PDF's attention at some point. So we were like, oh, maybe that would be an interesting thing. Maybe others might benefit from hearing some of that. So from there, let me segue right into, again, caveats, caveats. I'm putting doctoral study, and then I'm like, but there are so many subjects, so many different places, so many different experiences. Can I be sure this will be of use to a broad section of people? So I wimped out and put a in computer science next to that, because hopefully, some of this carries over, at least to other departments of computer science, certainly in the US where I am, but also probably in many other places, how general anything of what follows is, and how general they can be if applied to other disciplines, is sort of in the spirit of research, it's an open question. And maybe some of you will be in the future be able to put me right and answer some of those questions as well. Certainly, the actual disciplines of academic research vary a little bit from discipline to discipline. I've tried to stick to stuff that is not very controversial, shall we say, not very specific to things in computer science. So, for example, in this entire very sparse set of slides, you won't find anything about computing or programming or data or databases and stuff like that. So I'm trying to keep a hierarchical level above that. So how to do something, anything, such as a PhD. A wise man once said, begin at the beginning and go on till you come to the end, then stop. And quotation might be familiar to some of you. If not, there's a broad hint in the picture. Now, the point about that is, so there's a beginning and a middle and an end. And each of those is the most difficult part of the PhD. And I know that sounds bad. So yeah, that's true. Getting started is the most difficult thing. But having gotten started, being able to struggle through it is the most difficult thing. But once you have actually done that, then being able to put a proper end to it and not keep doing that forever, and taking the trouble to wrap everything around, tie a nice bow on top, is also the most difficult thing. Okay, yeah, that makes it sound like really difficult, and it is difficult, but not like impossibly difficult. Not what I'm trying to say. One of the things is, did you notice those were conditioned? So, for example, finishing the PhD is an absolutely not difficult thing to do if you didn't manage to start. So starting it is most difficult. But once you have started it, you have self-selected into a group of people who have all started the PhD. Now the most difficult thing is going to be to carry on. And if you manage to carry on, it's actually possible that you have really gotten into the swing of it. You're really enjoying yourself. You're conducting research unit after research unit, and you never want to end and become, a graduate, a PhD graduate. This happens to very few people, but it does happen to some. So you ought to be able to do that as well. All right. If you can answer a few questions, which is really all I'm going to pose to you in this talk, before you embark in starting the PhD at all, and especially in before embarking on any significant new phase including that last bit, which is when you stop, which is when you tie it together and defend, right? I think it helps a lot. It helps a lot if you can pose these questions to yourself and then answer them. And then on days when it's easy, doesn't matter. On days when it's difficult, you can hark back to those answers. And maybe that reminds you of why it's meaningful to keep going, or why it's meaningful to tie up all the loose ends. And always remembering that the answers are, once answered, it's not that the answer is graven in stone. You may need to change the answers. Almost certainly, each of us will need to re-examine our answers to important questions that we received by very sincere soul searching, and perhaps revise them from time to time. And that's okay. But what's not so safe to do is to embark without doing the soul searching, because failing to plan is planning to fail. And that's the PhD experience does tend to show up those lacks of background preparation, if you will. So, in line with that, I'd also remind that we should always remain open to changing our minds. And that shows that we still have a functioning mind. If it can no longer be changed on any topic whatsoever, at that point, I'm not sure you have one anymore. So, but of course, we must do that only when faced with adequate reason and data and such. Okay. So, questions. Um, Questions before answers, always the principle of the scientist or researcher. So, obviously, there are lots of questions, and you know that most questions have a question word in there, like what. And if you can just identify question words, you've kind of already gotten your questions about a particular domain. So if I say what, and I have no idea what I'm asking the question about, then let me examine what the question is about, right? What the domain is about. And I'll probably find a what question there, and probably multiple what questions there. Some of them might lead me to how questions and so on. So the questions are almost going to bring themselves in terms of the soul searching. So, but the ordering is important. And the very first one I would pose to any incoming PhD student or incoming student who desires, states an intent or a desire to go into a PhD program is why. And if you think I'm going to animate this slide and an answer is going to appear, no. There will be no answers. There'll be more questions. Because the answer's yours. I can't know your answer. I can only know your answer if you tell me. And of course, for anybody who wants to work with me, I do require them to first give me an answer that convinces me. And if I'm convinced and they're convinced, then we can even talk about that. So, but what would be typical, and incidentally, as much as these slides are full of a lot of empty space and a few questions thrown in here and there, I'm very happy for people, by the way, to stop me and ask questions in between. But if you don't, I'll keep going, and we can also, later come back to any of these things and pick them up. So, the for my part, what I will state is that for a convincing answer, I'm looking for a functional or operational one. So if a student comes and tells me something which is essentially based on uh, conceptual things, conceptual entities or ideologies, I'm very happy with that, but I'm not convinced, because I think that such things should be operationalized. I think that such things are always possible to operationalize, and it's that operational part that we want to try to get to. In other words, what would having the PhD allow you to do that without the PhD you would not be able to do? And why do you want to do that? Second order question. And why is it worth doing? Third order question. So those would be the kind of things I would ask you to think about if by chance any of you are in the position of, I think I'll go into a PhD. Many of you, I don't actually know the folks attending. So, or if you are watching this after, I certainly don't. So many of you might be in PhD studies. You may well be past your PhD studies, and you might be my contemporary or older. So only if this question applies to you, obviously. After the why question, one of the things that comes up is when, and that's both in terms of your time of life, but it's also in terms of what I'm seriously asking very basic questions here, which is when are you going to find the time to do the research? So now I may not be a good advertisement for this question because I started my PhD part-time and did it for several years part-time. But I am perhaps a dependable witness, therefore, when I say that's hard. And you risk not being able to do your job well or not being able to do the PhD well or to complete it or both. And that's very problematic. So if you're going to be a part-time student, sure, just tell me when you're going to sit down and do this. If you're going to be a full-time student, if you think that's the end of the story, that's not true. I really want to know when you'll do the work because so much occupies us. We all have to, eat, shop, sleep, live, all that stuff. And it's easy to keep doing the things that we know how to do, that we have become good at how to do, including taking courses and getting A's and stuff like that, or 90% marks, whatever it is, and not be able to spend adequate time at the thing that we haven't yet learned how to do or haven't yet started doing effectively and say that, well, I'll trade off time. This also needs to be done, right? I mean, my room needs to be cleaned, right? It needs to be tidied up, right? So I'll do that now. I'll do the research tomorrow. Well, your room's going to be tidier than it ever was in your life, and the research is not going to progress unless you actually answer that question when day by day and month by month and year by year. Time of life wise, as bad as it sounds, I'm just gonna say that comparatively early in your life is the only thing that makes sense. You might take a PhD or you might go into PhD studies straight off your bachelor's degree or your master's degree, and you don't have to. You can take that 5 years later, you can jump into it 10 years later. All these things are fine, but it probably doesn't really make as much sense, quite frankly, to do it when you are my age, for example, right? Or older, close to retirement. I'll retire and now I have nothing to do, so I will do a PhD. Okay, but that why question is going to tax me a bit. What will you do with it though? Because if this is an elaborate way to entertain yourself, I'd rather you didn't do it and left that slot open for somebody else that had their entire working life in front of them and would be able to contribute in terms of what a PhD does allow you to do. So, I mean, to my mind, the why question, convincing answers are often because I want to do a job or get a job that I wouldn't be able to without a PhD in this discipline. And then it becomes a much more understandable answer as to say, well, why that job? Why not some other job? Well, because that's the sort of thing I want to go into. Faculty career is often cited as an example because you can't even apply to be a faculty member at a graduate level at research one type institutions unless you already have a PhD in the discipline. So that's, then you have to ask yourself the much more second order removed question of why do you want to be a faculty member? But if you have that answer in your mind, then at least you know why you're going into a PhD. Or you might be like, no, I was working for company X and after the PhD, I want to go for company X again. That's what I want to do. But at a type of job role that they won't let me into unless I have a PhD. Also, excellent answer. I am not partial to faculty jobs as such. Okay, so then comes the other things, which sometimes for fresh students considering PhDs get asked and answered first. So the whole point of this slide is I'm encouraging you to do those other ones before looking at who are you going to work with, what exactly topic are you going to study, where, in what university, in what department, if there are multiple departments in that university that are potentially possible for you to learn at. And of course, there's a whole how. Now, some of this is going to end up being on the job learning. You're going to learn the deep knowledge about your subdomain. I assume you already know about your domain. If you are a computer science student, you've already learned basic computer science. If you are a mechanical engineering student, you've already learned basic mechanical engineering. But the deep knowledge about a subdomain, well, that's something you will learn during your PhD, the early parts potentially. If you have done higher studies before the PhD, you may have already learned. If you have been in a industry job in between, you may have already learned. The processes of research are something you're going to have to learn. Again, that can be the early stages of a PhD. Being prepared already when coming into the PhD because you did master's thesis research or something is great. That's excellent preparation. But not having it is not a problem at all. Most PhD students do start off from scratch in terms of these learnings. So the how is less of a problem, perhaps in some senses the least of the problem. Although in the seminar, we do focus a lot on the how, because the seminar, of course, is for students who already enrolled into the PhD, who are already committed to a certain extent to doing the PhD. So now I'll just go through a few slides that I show you unchanged from when I use that in that seminar. And I start with questions. I hope by now that's not a surprise. So I basically say, what is this? And, who should attend and why would you attend it? And when and where is it? But that's actually on the class schedule. So that's not really a surprise. Although I usually teach this seminar as one weekly class, which is literally 3 hours long. So that's something that I socialize a little bit initially. Then we try to have discussions, and this is what a workshop-like class means, that I don't intend to give answers to any of these. But I hold discussions on these questions, and then we would jot things down. So this particular year, what happened was that we noted some bullets down. I filled that out later, and therefore this is what we ended up with, which means that I don't end up with the exact same thing every time I run the seminar. But of course, I cheat because some of the really important things that I think must be articulated, I make sure those go in at some point, even if I just have to add them in later. Usually go through a bunch of self-introductions, and I usually have them write it down because that immediately creates a little more reality to it. People, can sometimes speak and not be very careful about exactly what they say, so communication can get a little off when folks write. And also it provides a side effect that creates a big document. That's the introduction of all the PhD students to each other and to faculty. And sometimes I will pass that to other interested faculty. And so the seminar is also a mechanism of letting students be visible to their potential advisors. So that usually takes some time. Then we get into what is the PhD, what is research? And again, there are thoughts and stuff, but in the introductory one, I say, but if you have answers, that is very personal. It's absolutely okay to ask those. This is the time to ask those. And by the way, that same invitation is open to obviously everybody that is that may have a question that I might just have some sort of an answer or contribute, thought to contribute to. Please ask now or later if you're watching this offline. They say that during the course of the semester, we will also articulate some common research processes, that it'll be workshop style, that you'll have to actually come do the work during those 3 hour long sessions. We take a break in between, obviously. And that failing to do so will mean that there's no makeup. You can't really make up for time lost as students going through, grade school or undergrad college, we keep thinking we can make things up, but nobody ever tells you this straight up front, that you can't make anything up because it's in the past. And we can't make time yet. We can't create, timey-wimey things yet. So you can't really make up. You might try to catch up. So there's no makeup. That's something I tell them. Sorry, I'm very popular with my students on some days. Um, okay, on another day, we might go into, usually the very second time we meet, we would go into what is research. And that's usually even more vague and flaky and fluffy in terms of the material I plan to present. So I really, really want that to come out of the discussion. So I don't have a lot of slides here, but again, let's try to talk through that a bit. And I have tried to again caveat that a bit by saying what is PhD research. So some of this is applicable to what is research. The rest may be specific to doctoral research. And instead of giving them any answers, which by now I wasn't going to do, I offer ways to think about it. So I say things like, well, if you had to define research, you all are in a PhD degree enrollment program. So you chose to do PhD, which is about doing research. So you must have some idea. It may need further refinement, but what do you think you know? What do you think research is? And if you are contemplating a PhD, that's a perfectly good question as well. What do you think you will be doing if you get admitted into the PhD program of your choice and choose to join that program, and then you are solidly in there, and that is your full-time occupation, PhD student? What will you be doing? Another thing I try to help them think about is, what does a PhD produce, or what does research produce in general? What do we normally, observe in research? So if you're like, well, if I had a farm worker, I have some sense of what that farm worker does because I can describe what I expect to see if I could observe the farm worker working at. I may be completely wrong about that, right? Today, a lot of farm workers in the US sit in a nice cottage and press buttons. But that may not be my mental picture. It doesn't matter. My point is that I have some idea. If I say, oh, I know a computer science researcher, well, what would they look like if you could observe them working, researching? What does somebody look like who is computer science researching or some other discipline researching? So that's what I mean by processes commonly observed. And finally, because at some point in the semester, I'm also going to come back and throw research ethics related and computing ethics related questions at them. I also encourage them to start thinking very early on about who does a researcher work for. Now, because we don't have the same sort of discussion environment here, I have some cheat balloons here that I will, briefly show you. Although there are many definitions of research, fairly, and some people heartily disagree and start fistfights on various opposing definitions of what is research. So, but nevertheless, one that is kind of, everybody tolerates this definition, so it's the closest thing maybe to something more or less universally accepted, is generation of new knowledge. Let's not mine every word in there, because that usually leads to absurdities like, can you generate old knowledge? Why do you need to say new knowledge if it's, generation? What is generation? Is it discovery? Is it invention? Is it all of the above? I don't know. Generation of new knowledge. That's actually whatever that says. And it's good to have those other soul searchings, just not, now maybe. So that's the goal, though. The goal is to answer open questions. Open questions means questions which can be asked, but to which the answer is not known. But in principle, an answer may exist. And perhaps it's not even known whether an answer exists or not. So if you can answer that question, now humanity knows something that it did not before. And if you can prove that there is no answer, then too, we have gained meta-knowledge. We have learned that there is no answer. So always generation of new knowledge. Products or byproducts are clearly new knowledge. And somehow the term papers always turns up. So PhD or research in general, especially academic research, always seems to be about papers. What's the deal with that? So we do talk a little bit about that at that point or later, and we talk a lot more about papers later. Now, I will say that papers are just one particular symptom of a well conducted and completed research unit. And it may not be always present. So, in a lot of research that is conducted outside academia, uh, papers may or may not come out of that research. In academia, it pretty much has to come out of the research, otherwise, it didn't happen. But in in the real world, sometimes the results of research are held confidential, at least for a while, and that means there may be a patent before there's a paper. There might not even be a patent if it's something very much stock in trade, super secret. Then maybe nobody tells anybody, and that's how the new knowledge exists for a bit. But the interesting thing about that is that sooner or later, knowledge will out, it seems. I commend to you, I won't go into that, but look at the history of mirrors. So this was one of the most, it was almost like China, the material, the bone china cups and dishes. So mirrors were a very closely guarded secret, and people were routinely killed in order to stop the secret from getting out. But eventually it got out. And now everybody has mirrors. Now nobody has mirrors because we all have phones with cameras. But I mean, mirrors do exist. So that sort of thing is where you have, if it's new knowledge, somebody gained it, they did not disseminate it, the knowledge died with them, somebody else rediscovered it at some point. The world eventually gets the knowledge when it gets disseminated. So papers are actually quite an important thing in research. But if I apply this question, what is the product or byproduct of PhD research? Then it seems quite reasonable to say it's not those things so much. It's the person, it's the researcher. The PhD experience produced a researcher. Of course, that person was a researcher throughout their PhD experience, but now, you see, they are an independent researcher. So, until that point, they were entirely supervised. So, one of the requirements of doing a PhD, finishing a PhD, is that you no longer need as much supervision. Indeed, you are completely independent. You can figure out your own research agenda. You can possibly go get funding or support for it, and then you can conduct that research. And indeed, you probably can now guide other people's research. So it is that transition which is really marked by the PhD. Byproduct, of course, there are papers. I don't know who graduates with a PhD without papers. But the how many papers you produced is functionally important depending on what job you are trying to, get. But it's the main thing that a PhD produces is a PhD graduate. Processes, that's almost like what are the processes of science or what is science. We do spend a lot more time afterwards on this. So at this point, we don't spend a lot of time on that. And then who does a researcher work for is always a fun question to try to float in a class of highly intelligent, opinionated 50 people that are just in their first couple of weeks of the PhD. So here are some candidates. Maybe all of them are correct. Maybe none of them quite capture it by itself. Maybe there are other things. But these are probably all good to keep in mind, again, for some of those difficult days to get through. Okay, with that, I'm going to jump into another set of slides as made during and presented at my 801 seminar. This is very short. It's actually literally after this title slide, I believe there are only 2 slides. But those 2 slides typically take me an hour and a half's discussion to produce. I try to reproduce these during the seminar, which no, today right here I can't. I'm showing you the end product because the important thing is to get into an understanding or a deep understanding or having done the thinking for yourself as to whatever is on these bullets. The bullets may not be exactly right. They may not even end up being in exactly the right place, but so it is. So what's a research paper? Why do we publish them? Dissemination, as we said, we want to inform the community, the world at large. We want to claim the credit for having come up with that knowledge. This credit is quite important to a lot of people a lot of the time. Um, Other times it's not so important to some specific people. All's fair. Sometimes to challenge. You write a paper, and sometimes in rare cases you get to publish papers that don't actually have research results. They're called position papers. Nobody is going to publish a position paper from you until you have already gotten some eminence in the field so that people cut you a bit of slack and they're okay, there's no proof here, but I mean, this guy's shown other things in the past that are good research. Let's take a moment to hear what they say. So in that sense, position papers might get published, and those can often be challenges. People publish position papers very often to challenge some sort of a norm, and sometimes to create the, sort of prepare the ground, because for the actual contribution papers they will send in the next few months or years. Reproducibility is something that's at the very heart of science. So that's something that's important, is to be able to describe the, not just the question, not just the answer, but how you can validate the answer so that a paper would be reproducible. That if you don't believe me, try it out yourself. And this is exactly what I did. So what I'm saying is, if you do exactly these things, you should see exactly that. That's in the nature of experiments, repeating experiments that have been done before. The expected answer to which we already know. We have all done those things. Remember all the physics labs and chemistry labs and whatever other your discipline labs that you have done in the, starting from high school, if your high school had labs, to college and stuff like that, right? There is a aspect here that we talk about, which is skepticism, which basically says that when I put my paper out there, right, it has to be peer reviewed. Otherwise, it's not really a paper, it's just a manuscript. And the peer reviewers are trying to find faults with the paper. That's their job. And then even when it gets published, because a peer reviewed paper may be reviewed by 3, maybe 4 people, and it may be that all 4 people were having a bit of an off day, the day they were reviewing your paper, and weren't quite as attentive as they should be. And your paper has some sort of a flaw or a hole, maybe not a gaping big one, but some sort of imperfection, and all the reviewers missed it. But the next thing that happens is your paper gets accepted, you're very happy, it gets published, you get 15 letters from different people saying, but what about that? That's wrong. And that's what the community is there to do. They're, there to hold us, each other, up to the standard of truth. So it's almost like the training of the researcher in terms of peer review, the scientist, any scientist himself or herself, is to always question, not question the not question the person, but to question the validity of the work. And so the if you show me some research work, my base position is always going to be my starting position. I'm required to do this by the honor of my profession. My base assumption is you are wrong. Whatever you're saying, you made a mistake. And it's my job to find that mistake and then take great pleasure in showing that to you. Okay, maybe not great pleasure. I'm a nice person. Very sadly, I will show it to you, but it is my job to find out where you made a mistake. And if I go in with that attitude and I spend hours examining your paper, maybe weeks rerunning an experiment that you have proposed, and I keep getting the same result you did, then that acceptance, that agreement has much higher value than if I'm your friend and I'm like, yeah, I'm sure all this is all right. Yeah, that looks, oh, beautiful figure, very nicely. This is fine, just publish it. Useless. So skepticism. And finally, if it wasn't peer reviewed and published, it didn't happen, a tenet that we take in academia, because of what we said earlier about the mirrors and such. Knowledge hidden away uh, isn't knowledge really, is it? Is it really knowledge? Because the knowledge is also lost when people pass on or forget, and it has to be rediscovered. So knowledge isn't knowledge until it's shared. Okay, this is the second of those two slides in which I list my version. This is a personal point of view, but it's a convergent point of view. Others will have similar things. I call these the skeptics questions. So if I'm a skeptic and I'm trying to read a paper, or if I wrote a paper and a skeptic is reading it, they start off with a few basic questions. And if any of those are not satisfactorily answered in the paper already at the time I'm reading it, that's reason for rejection. You have to convince me on all of these points before I'll accept it. And I won't go through the details here, but you obviously must first convince me that there is an open question out there, right? And part of that is to quote maybe prior work and things like that, but also to actually describe your problem specifically. There's a why should I care question. Research shouldn't be done in and of itself. It should be motivated. Now, the motivation can be pure knowledge based. A lot of math research is because we can ask the question and we don't know the answer. That's motivation enough, and that's fine. But if you're in a more engineering field, for example, then the motivation often has to be, how does this fit in with other things? What will this enable us to do that we can't do now? Because engineering is a doing sort of thing. Other kinds of scientific research disciplines, other kinds of motivations, but it should be motivated. How can your process be reproduced? How do you propose to go about it? That's a sort of a methodology or experiment design sections, which are different sections of a paper, can apply to that. All right, now that you have gotten with this far, I haven't thrown the paper away saying that's not an open question. Somebody already researched that and published that last year, stupid. If I have gotten past that point, I'm like, yeah, I guess that's an open question. I should have thought of that. I guess it is well motivated, fine. And yeah, okay, I understand the methodology. It's reasonable, it's repeatable, fine. All right, fine. Now tell me, what is it? What is it you're claiming is the answer? And that's when I read your answer. Then I want some proof, some verification, verifiability, falsifiability, and sort of a double check, a sanity check kind of thing. And that's a paper. I also, at a later point of time in a writing workshop, sort of part um, of the course or seminar, I also say that anything that does not go directly to answer one of those questions, you should throw it out of your paper because it's taking up space and it's going to take up attention and time from the reviewer for no good reason. So, tell me why it needs to be in that paper, otherwise throw it out. You can't just write about stuff because you love the subject and it feels good to you to write about it. So yeah, do that later. Write a monograph, publish a book, write a blog. This is about what I had, but I'm going to just show you, walk through, not really talk about a couple of slides. Actually, this is a large set of slides that are also on my website, incidentally. They were made a long time ago, right? I keep them unchanged because years ago, at some point, because of whatever, I don't quite remember the occasion, but I had the occasion to talk with a much more senior JBNSTS scholar who was also one of my professors when I was at Jadavpur University Electrical Engineering, Professor Tapan Kumar Ghoshal, till date one of the most influential professors I have met. And at this point, when we were talking, when I was already a faculty member, still many years ago, I said, I sometimes use a set of slides. And he was like, oh, interesting. Show me the set of slides. And when I showed him the set of slides, he later said something that I interpreted as that these are not completely useless. And that's pretty high praise. I mean, he actually was nicer. He said, oh, these are good. But I interpret that as there is some use out of these. So I've just left them on my website since then forever. I haven't changed them. Just walk through a little bit of that, cover some of the same things. What is research? And here talks a little bit about the stages, life cycle of a typical research project. Then I try to, talk a little bit about each of those, including the literature review. And then I say that, see how those stages map into the anatomy of a research paper. So this is a constructive way of looking at a research paper as a document that documents completely a research unit or a research project, instead of a deconstructive view, which is answering the skeptic's question. But of course, you do the stages in the research unit of work because you're going to answer the skeptic's question and walk away with a claim that is validated. If anybody is inclined, these are in my on my own website. Um, in terms of the skepticism thing, there's a lot of best practices and worst practices stuff out there. And a logical fallacy is something that has been acknowledged or recognized for a long time in various ancient civilizations. So there are many lists out there, and it's not the same list. There are different numbers of fallacies on different ones of them. One of the ones I liked is from Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted World, mainly because he didn't call it a list of fallacies, he called it a Baloney detection toolkit, which is exactly what it is. You know, when you see one of these things, it's one of the worst practices. Know that the person is not doing good science. If you find yourself on the verge of doing one of those things, pull back. So, they come in basically do's and don'ts. Many of these are familiar to many of you. You can find more about any of these in various online forums. So I think I'm going to basically stop there with a couple of quotations. And I can't describe these because these are just all people I know. So one of the things I do in that seminar is every year we have various faculty panels from faculty in our department, but also graduated PhD students from our department who are now in other jobs, faculty elsewhere, or in industrial research jobs, doing whatever. And this year, these are some of the quotations from that panel that I really liked, that I think resonate. So uh, the first one's pretty self-explanatory. The second one says, uh, do the research. That's the most important thing. But don't forget about presenting your vision, communication, dissemination. And to my mind, dissemination is absolutely part of research. So you haven't finished doing the research if you haven't finished writing the paper, creating a poster, creating a little few minutes worth of a video, having an elevator pitch about that research unit ready to go, and maybe made a longer, technical video about that. So all other skills. Be strong. There are going to be bad days, but there are going to be good days. In the end, it's going to be hard, but it's going to be worth it. Accept criticism. Enough said about that. That's a whole nother talk by itself. And project completion is really important. When you know something that you started is a few inches away from completion and it doesn't seem like this is going to be worth it, right? Complete just to gain the muscles, the mental muscles that let you complete. Because the most important thing to do in a project, in any project, is to complete. And the most important step in completing is the next step. Keep taking next steps. A typical technique is do the next easiest possible thing. Gets you a little closer. And keep doing that. When you run out of easy things to do, you'll have to do hard things, but complete. I have not left much time for questions, but I'm actually happy to be here for minutes more if that will help. And now I'm seeing there's also various chat messages.
Yeah,
So
I'll probably, I have already given the permission for anyone to unmute themselves. So anyone who has questions, they can jump up. I'll start with some questions, and based on some of the questions on in the chat, sort of take them together. Let's say I'm your PhD student, Rudra. On the same note as the skepticism that you provided for when you write a paper, how would you consider my skepticism towards, let's say, the kind of towards a specific, let's say you advise me on that, do this problem, solve this problem using this way, or do this and don't do that. In my experience, I have my own experiences, and that's where this question is from. How do you think skepticism should be towards one's advisor?
First of all, let me start by saying I only wish you were my PhD student. But for any PhD student, any PhD student or any advisor, I think, like, obviously it's a good question, a profound question, and like all profound questions, answers typically would start with "it depends," or at least that's how I would go about it, right? So, number one, think of where. So if it is essentially my advisor is telling me to proceed one way, and I'm skeptical about that, and I want to maybe question that, right? If so, is that the kind of scenario you were?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's
Similar.
take that scenario, and if it's a slightly different scenario, we can absolutely talk about that variant as well. But in that case, the first thing I would like to understand as that hypothetical student, right, is where my objection's coming from, right? So, in other words, is it because I have good reason to believe that avenue will not work out, right? Or is it because I have a different avenue, which I have reason to believe is much more likely to work out? Is it perhaps I just want to do that more? Is it because it's easier? These are all valid reasons, by the way. Just because something is easy doesn't mean it's wrong, or doesn't mean it's wrong to reorder things. I just said at the very end, do the easiest next step, right? So, but this depends on what the ensuing conversation is going to be like. Where are you in the stage of the PhD, right? Are you at the very outset where you expect to find new, surprising, kind of counterintuitive directives coming from you're expecting to learn new things. You know that you don't know how to do research, and if your advisor is telling you to do this, maybe there is a good reason. If so, then I would still ask a question. I would still have a conversation with the advisor, but I would address the meta question of, can you explain why this is the first thing we are trying, and not make it a challenge. Are you a late stage PhD student who at this point knows at least as much about her or his advisor as the advisor does himself or herself? Well, then by all means, do not sit back. You might be doing your advisor a disservice, right? By towards the end, the advisor's job is kind of to try to keep up and let you do your thing, right? So at that point the advisor still might be, so okay, that would be a good next thing to try. Find a polite way of saying, yeah, but there are these other 5 better things to try before we try that one. So, and always, I would hope that we can all always retain the humility, because even at the end of your PhD, even past your PhD, even let's say, to take a random number, 20 years into your advisor career, you certainly could be mistaken. You certainly could be missing potential good approaches. So be open. There's a saying that also says, always keep an open mind, but not so open that all your brains fall out. So that's I would just take that approach. But never not talk to your advisor is the only thing that I would say. If your advising relationship is such that any discussion is unwelcome, um, that's a go back to the soul searching you did before embarking on the PhD, the why, how, those things. Because maybe it's time to find a different advisor. I'm sorry to put it that way, but it might or might not be. It might be worth it for you to stick around, but that's not a healthy relationship, because in a couple of years you're going to graduate, and then it's going to be your job to question that other researchers' papers when they write them, and vice versa. That's what you're supposed to get trained into. So always talk.
Yeah, yeah, that actually completely jives with what I try to follow. In fact, what my advisor told me
Okay.
towards the beginning, and so he would always encourage me questioning, and he told me that, you know, when I faced these, like when he faced that these thoughts that, oh, whatever his advisor is telling him is probably not the right thing to do, what he would do is think that why his advisor is saying so, and maybe try out whatever his advisor is saying, like as an experimentalist. Let's say that's an experiment to perform, and either prove or disprove that that, you know, whatever his methodology is either right or wrong. So I try to do that as well. And towards the end, like after the third, or I think after the fourth year, he said, you know, I think my a part of my brains should now be in yours. So you should be knowing that what I would be advising you to do at this point when you face these issues. So you know, you tell me what needs to be done, and then we'll go from there. So yeah, I think that's completely in line with what I think most PhD students should be doing. There are a
Yes,
few.
I'd comment to that. That point when your advisor feels that way about you, when you know that you have gotten to that point, I think that's a nice point to be at. It feels good that your advisor thinks that way about you. But just to let you guys in on a secret, it feels even better to the advisor at that point.
Yeah. Maybe it actually felt a little like when that sort of responsibility comes over, it sort of adds to a little bit pressure to the graduate student. I won't hide. At least that's how I felt. Anyway, so I think Shonok Mojumdar had several questions, some of which we have probably already touched upon. I'll go quickly through them. Still, he asks, who addresses the question of motivation, the supervisor or the student, or do they both contribute? And sort of in line with part of the answer that you gave previously, that he also asks, we once discussed earlier that in some subjects, the approaches or methods change routinely. Projects may or may not work out. When one becomes independent, and by independent, you know, I guess he means like towards the end of the PhD research, fourth year or so on, with a certain amount of knowledge, how does one fare then in that changed area? Or does one adapt to keep pace with them? Is it expected of his supervisor to cooperate in this matter?
Yeah, and again, excellent questions. Let me try to quickly address each in that order, and then if there's, the answer probably will not be completely satisfying. So by all means, let's have follow-up discussions. So regarding the question of, coming up with motivation, it is similar to the discussion we had just now about who comes up with the methodology, who decides on what approach we should follow next, and things like that. With a less experienced PhD student should probably look for advice from the advisor. And even if there is a disagreement, to some extent, assume that their advisor maybe knows what they're talking about a little bit better than them, just because of the experience or familiarity with the field. Uh, a PhD student who's near completion may be at least as capable of deciding on some motivation than as the advisor. Um, but not necessarily. So let's see where motivation comes from, right? So motivation. So remember, motivation. This is not a spiritual motivation sort of things. This has the very specific meaning that I am able to answer the skeptic's question of why should I care? Why should I? You're like, I'm going to find this particular gear ratio under this kind of continuous variable transmission where also there is something else going on. I don't know. Fortunately, I have no idea what I'm talking about because I'm not a mechanical engineer. But suppose some meaningful question like that. And then because I don't know about that enough, it may be a question that will revolutionize the fuel efficiency of on-road vehicles in the future. Or perhaps it is something that's a mathematical curiosity that the math is known, there is no practical application. It's long been proved that there is no practical application, but nobody's quite, filled out that little detail there of how you apply this math to this useless problem. So that latter one would be less motivated or not motivated. The first one would be strongly motivated. But this requires you to know two things. It requires you to know your domain very well, whether that's on-road vehicles or whatever it is. And it also requires you to know the surrounding research very well, the so-called state of the art. So this is the so-called state of the practice and state of the art. State of the practice is the real world domain from which problems are coming, and the state of the art is what existing knowledge in research literature can already be applicable to that with some minimal, adjustment required. But that minimal adjustment required is not really the job of a researcher. It's the job of the practicing engineer out in the practice. And I'm an engineering person, I give you an engineering example. So to that extent, students early in their career are sometimes not able to have as much command of the big picture or the history, developmental history of that discipline, either in practice or in recent research, to be able to adequately come up with motivations. But they should try, because by the end, you want to have that expertise. So the other question was about, how when one becomes, so I think it was kind of about the fast obsolescence in some fields of your methodology knowledge, your skills knowledge, your whatever you have found out through your PhD, the deep knowledge that you newly generated. So yes, that's very real. So in anything and everything, the knowledge is going to become stale to a certain extent. At best, it will continue to be knowledge. It will continue to be true and meaningful, just not at the forefront of the intellectual endeavor in that field anymore. At worst, it will be just outdated, obsolete, and just plain wrong potentially. So no longer true under the changed circumstances. Yes, a researcher has to, if they want to continue researching, they have to continue to stay up, keep up with the, not just the field, but the edge of knowledge in their own specific expertise. So in the PhD, you're getting depth about some area, but about a narrower and narrower uh, realm of knowledge. So you're getting very deep knowledge about a very narrow question potentially. And the actual knowledge generated during a PhD becomes obsolete the earliest. But the PhD researcher that we produced, right, has hopefully become an independent researcher. So they have mastered the art and science of continuing to keep up with the literature, of continuing to transfer their deep knowledge in slightly contiguous but slightly different areas, and to slowly twist and turn as the field itself advances, and to keep themselves current. So this is how you keep pace with it, is by running as fast as you can. And that's something that's um, the learning of that, how to do that process, also happens during your PhD. So that's part of the independent researcher model. If you have not learned how to get in deep into a field you did not have deep knowledge about, but which is contiguous to your other learning so far, then maybe you're not ready to graduate. You do need to learn that. That's a skill. Is it expected to continue cooperating or collaborating with your supervisor, with your advisor, former advisor, after you have graduated? So yes and no, and it depends a lot on the system and on the expectations of the discipline. So if a meaningful collaboration is possible to continue with your advisor, why would you not, right? But every unit of time, work, effort that you provide to that collaboration has to come from somewhere else. So you could be following something else and you're not doing that. Now, in the US, and very often the assumption is that the new person will continue to publish a lot. And that's typically the expectation for faculty jobs. But then you need to basically start up your own sub specialization, sub fine specialization that probably distinguishes you from your advisor, because your advisor is probably not ready to retire. If you were their last PhD student, then fine. But for most of us, most of the time when we graduate, our advisor is not ready to retire. They're going to keep publishing, and you're going to be competing in the idea marketplace and the publication marketplace with them. It's a friendly competition. It's a good thing. But that means that you have to become your own person as well. And to that extent, if you can equally well spend some effort with continuing collaborations with your advisor versus your own new stuff, and the chances of reward in terms of completed research, published papers, funding gained is about the same, always choose to go your own way. But if by producing the same hour of collaborative work, I get 10 times as much papers because it's a particularly lucrative field with my advisor, then by all means, go do that, but also find time to do something of your own. I Was there another question there? These are the ones I remember. Um, I see on the chat, it says, how should one decide on a guide or a lab?
Yeah.
Um, Coming down very much to brass tacks, right? Academic work is often qualified or often culminated in papers that we have been saying, right? Papers are often, published based on how good they are, how much they impress the peer reviewers, how cutting edge they are, and so on and so forth, right? So in brief, see what that lab has been publishing, see what that advisor has been publishing, see what that advisor's other students have been publishing, recent students, current students, right? If you are impressed with that, then that may be a place for you. If you're interested by that, then that may be a place for you. If you are neither interested nor impressed, then that's probably not the right place for you to apply or go on to, right? I don't know if that was the kind of answer you were looking for, but let me stop there. And again, if someone is in a core department like mechanical engineering, how difficult is it to do a PhD abroad in CSE? So it's not easy. That one merits a further, possibly one-on-one discussion. Feel free to email me, please. This is fielding questions and hopefully helping prospective students, whether in my department or not, doesn't matter, is part of my job. So let's carry that conversation offline. So, but I'd just say it's not super easy. It's not impossible, but it probably is a longer, harder road. May involve another master's degree in between or some such to switch disciplines to that extent, because we do need the basic preparation in the area. Anybody in any discipline, we assume that we build on that. Does an academic community accept it if a researcher shifts his area or her area to expertise to a related discipline after his PhD? Yes, the very much so. If each of us had to just continue doing stuff that we did for our PhD, none of us would survive. We'd all die, because that doesn't last for very long after the PhD. The your PhD thesis itself is a very perishable commodity. It's like bananas. It goes bad in 3 or 4 days. So it's like maybe 3 or 4 years. But the you absolutely have to keep following the field, keep moving, but it's like one of those puzzles where there's a lot of dots, and if you join them, you have some shape. But if the dots are too far apart, you have no idea what you're joining and you don't end up with a nice picture. So the trick to never having to make a huge, big jump and essentially reboot your career and throw away years of expertise is to never stop moving. You're always moving, so you're never having to move very fast. It's always, possible to keep up. Perhaps that's the sort of in a fast-moving field, which I guess Shonak is in. Maybe that's mechanical or something as well, energy engineering. This is, I mean, it's essential for a researcher. Otherwise, it's better to be a practitioner where you have deep knowledge about something. You are going to mine that deep knowledge, keep practicing it for some decades, and then you're going to be obsolete, but you have made enough money to retire, so you're good. If you're going to be a researcher, keep moving.
Right, thanks. So few couple more questions. When during my PhD, my advisor used to say, let's say from the third year onwards, that Debarghya, I need you to see the big picture, but at the same time, you should not lose focus on the small details when you're doing the experiments. So what's a possibly good way of striking that balance? And how can people across fields, like what is meant by the big picture, so on? What do you think? What do you would say on that?
These advisors, so do this, but do that also. So they, no, that's a great question, and I think that's a very meaningful thing for an advisor to say as well. That's exactly what I would like to tell all my PhD students. So I would again structure it so along first the skeptics questions and then a different analogy, right? So when you are thinking of the big picture, right? In the big picture, how big is the big picture? How small is your thing? And why is the big picture there if that is what you're going to focus on? Those few pixels there, that's your bit. What does it matter in the big picture? Well, if the big picture is in pastel colors and you have gone back to your nursery days and you're coloring that your spot bright red, maybe it doesn't look nice. Okay, that's a bad analogy, but the point is that what you are doing needs to fit in with the big picture, right? And the skeptic's question that is most meaningful in this instance is again motivation. Why do I care? You care about that little spot because you care about that little spot. Maybe it holds particular meaning for you. Maybe your advisor said this is what you need to do to get your PhD. Maybe something in between, doesn't matter. You already care about that. But why does anybody else care? Nobody else is in that spot, so nobody else cares. Just understand that nobody else cares unless you can make them care. And to make them care, you have to understand what they care about, which is somewhere off in that thing. So you're here, that is there. To see both, you have to zoom out. So now you have a picture that is bigger than your little spot. And the people that you have to motivate as they get further and further away from your own expertise, you have to understand a bigger and bigger picture in order to answer the question, why should anybody else care? Okay, so that is the thing. Now, imagine therefore, this is a discipline you can do. Imagine explaining what you are researching and the importance of researching that to a fellow student in your lab, to another faculty member in a similar discipline, but not your advisor, to another faculty member of that same subject or department, but who is in a different subdiscipline, to another faculty member or researcher who is in a completely different college, to somebody that is not a faculty or a researcher, but who is a family member, a very young family member, a very old family member, a legislator, a funding agency administrator. Once you have got all those answers, once you can motivate all of these people, your picture is pretty large and you have full grasp of the big picture. But what good is it if you drew that full picture, if and the funding agency says, okay, this is, you have convinced me, I will give you money, and your grandparents say this is incredible, we never believed that you might actually do such impactful work, we will give you money or whatever, we'll give you a house to stay in, I don't know, we'll give you something you want or need, and you've got all these resources, right? Your advisor is like, sure, you can have a research assistantship, I'll give you the whole lab. I'll kick everybody else out. And you've got all the, nobody's going to say any of these things. Okay. But some semblance thereof. And now what do you do with it? Unless you have retained laser focus on what you're doing and be able to do something that only you can do, because only you have that deep knowledge about that little bit, then you have now been handed the big picture. You now have the coloring pencils and the spray guns and all sorts of stuff, but you don't know how to color it. So that's why you have to keep focus on that stuff as well. And if that sounds like two different things you have to do at the same time, they are, but they're related, which is good. Sometimes you have to do completely unrelated things.
Yes, muted. So thank you once again. There is one last question from Shonok. I'm just reading it out. Does the academic community accept it if a researcher shifts his area or her area of expertise to a related discipline after his PhD? Yes, thanks for the answer. And regarding Shiny's question, I might ask, what does my potential advisor or school look in me when they consider my application, even when I do not want to change my subject area?
That's obviously an excellent question, and now I must make much more wimpy caveats about. I can only tell you about the general nature of, for example, what my department would look for, or similar other departments, or people similar to me, because it does probably vary a lot between disciplines. So I don't, I don't know. So we look for preparation and motivation. So very simply, it's just literally those two things. So you might be one of the most motivated researchers, motivated to be PhD students, people in the world, but if you don't have the adequate preparation, then we don't think you will succeed in our department. So we are reluctant to admit you, or if admitted, fund you. Versus if you have perfect, great preparation, but we get the sense that it's not research that motivates you, it's not the generation of new knowledge, then again we are going to wonder, clearly you have the ability and the preparation, but will you have the determination to stick with it during those bad days? And there will be bad days when it seems like the easiest thing is to chuck the whole thing and just go on to something else. Now, typically, especially in a US university, in this kind of my kind of discipline, a department invests essentially a boatload of money for every PhD student we admit and bring over. And this is even if we are unable to fund them, because we're already providing a good deal of resources that we are locking away for that one PhD slot. And typically, so my department, for example, will not admit anybody that they're not prepared to fund. So every incoming student also gets funded. So that's another bit of money added to that. So we need to be careful about that this person will in fact stay the course and will complete the course. Now, how do you look for that? So in terms of preparation, well, if you send us, transcripts from your previous degrees, then that's something. It's not anything and everything, but to some extent, it's fair to say that if somebody has good grades, and we know that college, and we know lots of colleges, obviously in our discipline, we keep track of hundreds of institutions and how their degrees are and how their students from there are progressing through the academic system. So we have a reasonable sense of what a transcript from a particular given department from some good department around the world means. If you have got good marks, then we're like, okay, this person possibly has the right preparation. If the marks are really not very good, like not a little bit of a dent here and there kind of thing, but if they're like flat across the board, if they're sort of flatlined across the board, then we are like, this person may be well motivated. Clearly they are motivated, but we cannot be confident that they have the right preparation. Marks don't mean anything. Sometimes some student that got low marks in everything across the board actually has deep knowledge about everything across the board, but there's no way for us to tell. So absent any other way, we would go with these transcripts. Recommendation letters, that's why they are so important, because they can speak both to the preparation and to the motivation, right? Of course, now that there are 1,500 different templates out there on the web for what are good recommendation letters, it's also kind of hard to know what carries exactly what meaning. But we try to have a sense of that as well. So again, that is something that experience has taught us functionally or operationally. Um, a statement of purpose from an applicant can mean a lot. Again, I'm talking about my discipline and that sort of stuff. Today, we also, in the last few years, we have also in our department started asking not just for a statement of purpose, which is free form, but also specific answers to specific questions or responses to specific questions, which are, I think, still optional. But naturally, if somebody chooses to answer, we'll look at those answers, right? And those answers and the statement of purpose together can sometimes give us information we would otherwise not get. Sometimes, and again, how to say, there are many thousands of, or how many hundreds at least, of templates for statements of purpose also on the web. So, and it's good to reuse stuff. It's good to start from that. But at the end of the day, it's got to be your statement of purpose. So unless we see the person emerge from that written content, then it's not like we're saying that's a no. We're saying that's not giving us any input into the process. So some student wrote a standard statement of purpose. The statement of purpose didn't enter into our considerations of whether to admit or fund that student. Some applicant wrote a statement of purpose that is clearly very personal, very meaningful, gives us actual information, we think, about the motivation or preparation of this person, then that is something we would take into account. So it's not completely formal-like, but these are some of the most important things we're looking for.
All right. Thank you, Professor Rudra Dutta. I think we have pretty much reached the end of our session. And if someone has more follow-up questions, whoever would be watching offline, please feel free to contact Professor Rudra Dutta. His email is on his website. And if you have a few other words to finish the session, Rudra, else we'll conclude. Thank you once again for your time and everyone for joining on an Ashtami evening.
That's right, and thank you, all of you that joined, and Debarghya and others in the JBNSTS PDF. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.